So the next MCU show, Marvel's What If, has begun with the release of Season 1's first episode, What If Captain Carter Were the First Avenger. This is a show I have been highly anticipating, especially now with the ending of Loki and how that show basically introduced the multiverse to the already pretty expansive Marvel Cinematic Universe. I love the idea of a movie or show that takes a story or stories that we all know and love and basically says, what if this happened instead? From this point on, I will be reviewing each episode of What If as the show airs on Disney Plus every week. So without further ado, let's talk about episode 1. Let me start off by saying that season 1's first episode is awesome. I loved almost every minute of it, and I would even say that starting the series off with an episode that explores a what if scenario of Captain America the First Avenger was the perfect way to open this show if we're talking about this from a chronological standpoint. Captain America, as his first movie's title indicates, is the first Avenger. So from a chronological standpoint, it makes perfect sense to start this show off with a what-if scenario of that movie. From the moment the episode started, I can already tell that Jeffrey Wright is gonna absolutely kill it as the Watcher. His voice carries a sense of foreboding, warning, and knowledge, and even though he only really makes himself known in the beginning and end of the episode through narration, his presence looms over this episode in an honestly pretty chilling yet captivating way, as the Watcher, ironically like the viewer, is simply a spectator to these events, but he has this all-knowing presence about him that carries over into his line delivery beautifully, making him the perfect guide into these new realities. I love the Watcher's line where he says a single choice created a whole new hero, not just because of how perfectly it foreshadows Peggy's transformation into Captain Carter, but also because of the implications it has for this series and the rest of the MCU. If something as seemingly insignificant as a single choice can branch off and create a whole new reality, then that introduces an infinite amount of possibilities for where this series could go and how it could potentially impact the rest of the MCU going forward, which excites me tremendously. I really loved how this episode explored the small and major impacts of Peggy's choice to stay when asked if she would be more comfortable in the booth rather than go to the booth like she did in the first Avenger. For instance, the Hydra agent who was sent to get the super soldier serum and kill Dr. Erskine makes his move early before the process of turning Steve into a super soldier can begin, which results in Steve getting shot and Peggy becoming a super soldier instead. But we also see how other choices after that impacted the narrative of the preceding events. For example, when Zola is captured by Captain Carter before he ever meets Bucky, he isn't there to perform the experiments on Bucky Barnes that would eventually turn him into the Winter Soldier. Instead, we first see Bucky amongst the rest of the 107th prisoners when Captain Carter goes to rescue them from Hydra, and because she recovered the Tesseract from Hydra in the process, Zola and the Red Skull weren't able to harness its power to create weapons, and I loved that. One of my worries going into this series is that each episode would be a condensed retelling of the movies, just starring different characters, and while there are scenes that are directly from the first Avenger in this episode, it still overall feels like a different narrative. Sure, it hits a lot of the same story beats like Captain Carter and the Howling Commandos attacking a train to extract a prisoner and Captain Carter getting sent almost 70 years into the future, much like in the first Avenger, but it's how the narrative gets to those beats that's different, and those story beats are still as emotionally impactful in this episode as they were in the first Avenger. The episode is naturally very fast-paced, which I was kind of expecting because of the runtime of the episodes, and I'm pretty sure all the episodes are going to have a very similar pace, but I never felt that the pacing hindered my enjoyment of the episode. The story flowed as fluidly as I was hoping it would, despite it being more condensed when compared to the runtimes of the movies, for example. It was wonderful to hear Hayley Atwell play Peggy Carter once again, and it was just as awesome seeing her as Captain Britain, or Captain Carter in this case. In such a short amount of time, I fell completely in love with this variant of Peggy Carter. She still comes across as a tough as nails and stoic presence in the way that she did in the movies, but she's also super charismatic and really funny. I really enjoyed the first action sequence where she is fully discovering the abilities that the super soldier serum has granted her. Her excitement made for some great comedic moments, although she also manages to feel like a complete and total badass. The ending of the episode, which sees her flung through an interdimensional portal which seemingly takes her to the exact place and point in time Loki came down to Earth in Avengers 1, almost 70 years into the future, tells me that Marvel aren't quite done with this version of Peggy Carter, which I'm thrilled about because I would love to see more of this character and where her story could go from here. I also thought that Josh Keaton did a pretty good job as Steve Rogers. You can tell it's not Chris Evans doing the voice, and there were admittedly a couple of times where I did feel it was obvious that he was doing an an impression of Chris Evans, which was a little bit distracting, but overall I do think he delivered a pretty good impression. I love seeing Steve kicking ass in the Hydra Stomper. The suit is basically a World War II Iron Man suit, and I fecking love it. It's such a cool design. As expected from Marvel at this point, there is a fair amount of comedy, and I must admit, I found it a little hit or miss. Comedy is naturally very subjective, and I wouldn't really say any of the jokes were poorly delivered or executed. They just weren't that funny for me. It was a little too corny for my taste. Although I'd be lying if I said that Peggy running up next to a Hydra soldier who was on a motorcycle didn't make me chuckle quite a bit. They do absolutely nail the human stuff though. I, as usual, love the romance between Peggy and Steve. I think that's the best romance in the MCU period, but I particularly love what they did with it in this episode. It's like a role reversal. Whereas in the first Avenger, Peggy was the one that motivated Steve, now Steve is the one who motivates Peggy. And I really enjoyed how they utilized that role reversal in this episode to tell a very similar yet different version of their romance, which I thought was very effective. The action was fantastic. The action sequences in this episode reminded me quite heavily of the action scenes in the Captain America trilogy, in that they were able to bring out the same excitement that comes when I watch the Captain America movies. They're fast-paced, really well choreographed, and yeah, like the Captain America films, there were a lot of cuts, but the sequences are edited in a way that doesn't blur or obscure what you're seeing on screen. The action scenes that stood out to me the most were definitely Peggy's first mission where she captures Zola, but I especially love the sequence where she and the Hydra Stomper are taking on the Hydra Spitfires, and Captain Carter is just jumping from plane to plane, taking each one out as she goes. It's a visually stunning sequence that literally gave me goosebumps. That was the sequence that had me staring at the screen in complete goosebumps-induced awe with my mouth dropped open thinking, feck yeah, this show's gonna be freaking awesome. I think my least favorite action sequence was when Captain Carter and the crew went up against the giant tentacle Cthulhu thing. That felt a little generic to me, and it wasn't as visually interesting as the other action sequences, but even then the sequence was still pretty enjoyable, and I like the potential implications that Red Skull summoning an interdimensional being has for the rest of the series going forward. Which leads me to the animation. The animation is beautiful. The lighting and the texturing of the characters are wonderfully animated. The movement of the characters as well as their facial and body expressions are perfectly fluid, and the use of color was mesmerizing. While I am really happy that this episode feels like a different take on the story of the first Avenger rather than a beat-for-beat retelling but with a different character, I did very much enjoy the visual references and parallels to that movie, and they didn't take over the episode in a way that felt jarring or unnecessary. I particularly enjoyed the montage of Peggy just kicking Hydra's ass, which felt very similar to the Star-Spangled Man montage from the first Avenger. Scenes and moments like that effectively served to show Captain Carter's progression as a character as well as act as cool homages. On the whole, I really enjoyed this first episode. It's a great start to what will hopefully be a great season of Marvel TV. I really hope that the rest of the show knocks it out of the park as much as this first episode did, because this show has so much potential. Nonetheless, this episode is good enough to get me excited for the rest of the season. What If Captain Carter Was the First Avenger gets an 8.7 out of 10. So that was my review of episode 1 of Marvel's What If. I do hope you enjoyed this video. What did you think of this episode? Did you think it was good? Did you think it was bad? Did you think it was somewhere in the middle? Please leave your thoughts down below in the comments, and I will indeed see you guys in the next one. Live long and prosper, and may the Force be with you always.